Welcome to Genetics 3, Qualitative Genetics. There's actually two types of traits, qualitative versus quantitative traits, and we're going to discuss the difference in this 15-minute video. I'm Tony Sikora, and will be your host today on the video. As I mentioned, there are two types of traits, so we can look at the different traits that we find in animals or plants or humans. And generally, we can characterize these traits into two different categories, either qualitative or quantitative. And what characteristics are we looking for to do this classification? So the first thing we might look at is how many genes, or genes at how many loci may influence the trait. So for qualitative traits, the expression is usually influenced by just genes at one loci or two or three loci. Whereas quantitative traits are generally influenced by genes at hundreds of different loci. So many genes are going to influence your quantitative traits. So each of these 100 genes, they may have just a very small effect. And by looking at the animal for quantitative traits, it's very difficult to determine which particular gene you might have at a loci. Another distinguishing characteristic to categorize these traits is, are there distinctive phenotypes, or are the traits measured or scored on more or less a continuous scale? So qualitative traits generally have distinctive phenotypes. You can look at the animal and tell what it is. A couple of examples here. Is the animal polled or is the animal horned? Distinctive phenotypes. Does the animal have a black coat color, or does it have red coat color, or is it a white coat color? Quantitative traits usually measured on or scored on a continuous scale. And for our example here, we've got growth rate. And say we have three animals, and we measure them at the beginning of a growth period and at the end, and we find that of the three animals, we had one that grew 2 pounds a day, one that grew 2.5 pounds a day, and one that grew 3 pounds a day. So we have a low, medium, and high, but and so we go along and we measure a few more animals. And when we measure these additional animals, we find that, well, we have one at 2.15, and if we have a real precise scale, we've got one at 2.44 pounds per day. We've got a couple more in here, and so we've got, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8. We've got 9 animals measured now, and they're all different. So we don't have distinctive categories for this quantitative trait. And we often say that distribution of animals for a quantitative trait will often approximate this bell-shaped curve, where a lot of your animals, maybe 3/4 of them, are going to be somewhat around average. And then as you get further away from average, the number of observations on the low end and the high end are going to be fewer and fewer. So we've got this bell-shaped curve distribution, and so we got an animal here, we got an animal here, we've got an animal here, etc. Now this variation that we see is going to be influenced by the genetics of the animal and also the environment, which brings us to the next. Qualitative traits are generally not influenced all that much by the environment. If the animal has pigmentation for black hair, it's going to have black hair regardless of what you feed the animal or if the animal's stressed or whatnot. Nutrition generally not going to change the black hair to red hair. While quantitative traits are generally greatly influenced by the environment. And as far as the cause of variation, the environment is usually going to cause more phenotypic variation than what the genotype even causes. So for a quantitative trait like rate of gain, for example, or average daily gain like we already talked about, the environment can greatly affect the rate of gain, maybe have more of an influence than the genetics. So if an animal's on a real low plane of nutrition, maybe a really bad pasture, they're not going to grow very fast. Grow maybe 3 times slower than one that's on a high energy diet. If it's really hot out, the animals are not going to eat very much and they're going to grow very slowly. So the environment can really have a great effect on a lot of these quantitative traits. Most genetic defects fall in the category of qualitative. You got a genetic defect, usually it's just one gene that's defective. The animal either has the defect or they don't. You got the two distinctive categories. Quantitative traits, most performance traits are in this category. Most performance traits are going to be influenced by a lot of genes. Most performance traits are going to be influenced a lot by the environment. So here we have just a list of 10 different traits that we may have in livestock or companion animals. And at this time, I'd like you to just take a little time and decide, is this a qualitative trait or quantitative trait? Is it influenced by a few genes or a lot of genes? Is it influenced a lot by the environment? And just kind of mark out where you think the animals go. And sometimes you might have a trait that could be either or. But just hit the pause button and go through and see where you're going to make your mark. And then I'll come back and give you my opinion on these traits. Feed efficiency is measured generally as pounds of feed per pound of gain, maybe pounds of feed per 100 pounds of milk produced. Feed efficiency is extremely important because generally the largest cost of producing animals is the feed that they consume. So generally feed efficiency is going to be influenced by hundreds of genes. These genes may affect appetite, may affect whether they waste feed or not, may be influenced by, the immune system. If animals are sick, feed efficiency is going to go down. Feed efficiency definitely influenced by the environment. If it's really cold, it takes more energy just to keep warm, which is going to decrease feed efficiency. And it's definitely measured on a continuous scale with no two animals maybe having the same score. So we're putting that over in the quantitative category. Next, ear length. So I got these in two categories. Quantitative, probably most often. Ear length on individual animal, the relative size of an animal. Obviously, bigger animals on average have bigger ears. And size of the animal, generally a quantitative trait influenced by the environment, nutrition, genetics at a lot of loci, etc. However, we do have a few examples where a ear size can be greatly influenced by one gene. Example of that is Lamanca goats. So here we have Lamanca goats with a very small ear. And actually in Lamanca goats, there's actually two distinctive types of ear. One is the elf ear and the other one a gopher ear. Now we have the Nubians here, and they've got really big ears, and part of Nubians' ancestors came from tropical areas where they had the bigger ears to dissipate heat. But difference here is just distinctive categories, obviously, and just influenced by a few genes. So this difference that we see here, definitely a qualitative trait. Back fat in pigs is the term used to measure the fat thickness. In jelly in pigs, you want a little bit of fat. Obviously, you don't want a really thin pig, but we don't want them extremely fat. So generally, we try to select for somewhat leaner pigs or pigs with less back fat. Definitely a quantitative trait. Influenced a lot by the nutrition environment. It's also influenced a lot by genetics, but it's many genes are going to influence how fat a pig is going to get. Liver size was our next category there, generally considered a quantitative trait. And there are a few exceptions to that. There's a major gene discovered in merino sheep called the Barolo gene that by itself increases lambs per ewe by 50%. So this one gene can have definitely a major effect. Previously in this chapter we talked about the gene in a type of sheep where it influences ovulation rate and greatly increases it. And that'd be a qualitative trait there. Coat color, we're generally going to call that a quantitative trait in most aspects there. I've got one little X here on quantitative and illustrating it down below. So we got an exception here if we're looking at Holsteins. Dairy cattle can be almost completely black to almost completely white. Most are going to be a pretty good mix. But we could go into the dairy barn that we have on campus with 120 cows, and we could score them all on percent black versus white. So here we have one that's 95% black. This one here maybe 40%. This one here maybe only 5% black. And would have everything in between. Definitely measured on a continuous scale. It's percent black versus white wouldn't be influenced by hundreds of genes, but it's probably influenced by genes at several different loci. It's also going to be influenced by the environment somewhat. It's going to be influenced by the uterine environment. And you can have identical twins that can come out slightly different in percent black. Kind of example somewhat of a quantitative trait, but like I said, your coat color, generally in most cases, we're going to call it a qualitative trait. Eye color, kind of like coat color, most times it's going to be a qualitative trait. So we've got 3 X's there, and really for all traits you can kind of find some exceptions. And you know, you would think that both eyes would be the same coat color, but in white cats sometimes you can get a blue eye and a yellow eye. So Uh, Always some exceptions, but eye color, and if you look at your eyes, most people are going to have the same colored eyes, and for both eyes, it's going to be influenced by genes at just a couple of loci. You can have different shades, which may be influenced by the environment somewhat, but whether you get blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes, uh, you're going to have those categories influenced by just a couple of genes. IQ, now, we generally don't talk about IQ in animals because we don't have an objective test to measure it, but we do say that some animals are smarter, maybe easier to train than others. So definitely we do spend a lot of time training companion animals, for example, like dogs. We also may have performing animals in a circus or rodeo. We spend time training them. Well, definitely it's influenced by a lot of genes. It's influenced by the environment. Training an animal is an environmental effect. So we're going to put this in the quantitative category. An exception might be a genetic defect that may have a huge negative effect on mental development. And in that case, it's one genetic defect has a huge effect. The animal is abnormal, and that'd be in a category by itself. And you could say that particular condition could be classified as a qualitative effect. Racing speed, we'll call that one quantitative as well. Definitely a performance trait. Definitely influenced by a lot of genes. Genes that are going to affect how fast, swift the muscles can contract. Genes that are going to influence how fat versus lean the horse is. Genes for how much muscle the horse has. Does the horse have a long, smooth muscle, or maybe a bunchier muscle that would slow the horse down? Genes that are going to influence the overall health of the horse. So hundreds of genes are going to influence racing speed. And then the environment is also going to have a huge effect. One environmental effect, of course, is the weight and skill of the rider of the horse. Horses are trained over extensive periods so that they race faster. Training is definitely an environmental effect. So we're going to put the racing speed totally in the quantitative category. Statute's going to belong in the quantitative category. If we measure how tall animals are, it's definitely influenced by genetics, and there's at least in humans, we've identified quite a few different genes that affect how tall a person might be. There's also a lot of genes identified in areas of the chromosomes in cattle that are going to influence how tall or short that particular cow might be. So maybe not influenced by thousands of genes, but definitely influenced by dozens of genes. And of course, the environment's going to play a role there too. Animals' growth can be stunted if it's on a very low plane of nutrition. So generally a quantitative trait, measured on a continuous scale, influenced by the environment, influenced by many genes. And we do have an exception here, and that is in some livestock species, we have a dwarf gene. And so here's an example in Angus. This is a mature Angus bull that's only 3 feet tall. And the reason he's only 3 feet tall wasn't because of the environment, it was because of the one single dwarf gene at that particular loci. So we can put animals into two categories. They're normal in size or they're dwarfs. So that would make that particular trait qualitative. Last trait here is meat quality. Definitely, we're generally going to consider it as a quantitative trait, and there have actually been about 100 different genes in pigs that have been identified and shown to influence meat quality. Uh, but here again, we have one exception to that, and that there is a major gene that does have a tremendous effect on meat quality, and that is the PSS gene. PSS stands for porcine stress syndrome. This gene was actually identified about 40 years ago. This gene makes pigs heavier muscled and leaner, but it results in very poor quality pork. The pork is going to be definitely leaner but very dry, and it's going to lack holding capacity. So not only do you lack the intermuscular fat, but it's also going to lack water and lack taste. You definitely do not want to raise pigs with the PSS gene. And that concludes Genetics 3, I guess. Hope you're having a good day.